Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the September edition of the Glacier Book Club. Hard to believe, as I mentioned it, it's already September. Fall is upon us, and it's just such a treat to be with all of you again and to celebrate this time in community with each other, fellow glacier lovers. And we are so fortunate again this year to have had 6 really outstanding featured books on the 2023 calendar for the Glacier Book Club. But I know for many of us, the moment the list came out, we circled this day and this book as being of particular interest. The topic is just in the wheelhouse of the kinds of projects you've helped support in terms of scientific wildlife research in the park. The geography is specific to Glacier and the Rocky Mountain West, and the author is a gifted writer with significant local, national, and international bona fides. I mean, after all, how often do you get somebody whose last name is also a glacier in Glacier National Park? So Rob Chaney has called Western Montana home for a lifetime. He is and as a reporter at the Daily Missoulian, has covered, if not all, I think nearly all of the beats that the paper has to offer. Now the managing editor of the paper, in his spare time, Rob has also worked on collaborative projects with journalists around the world, including in Nepal, Brazil, and China, and has his photographs published in small boutique publications you might not have heard of, like the New York Times, the Seattle Times, and Orion Magazine. He's also been awarded fellowships at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard and at the National Evolutionary Science Center at Duke. His first book, Grizzly in the Driveway, the one we're going to talk about tonight, was published by the University of Washington Press in 2021. And he's working, as I mentioned, on a second book about which we might just be able to convince him to give us a preview during our time together tonight. Rob Chaney, welcome to the Glacier Book Club, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for bringing this rather remarkable crowd together.
Yeah, it is such a treat, and we certainly have a lot to talk about, and I want to take a moment of personal privilege, I guess, to start out with a personal note. You know, as many of you know, I'm old, so I've had a long career and a lot of it in public service. And in that regard, I've had the opportunity to interact with reporters from across Montana. And as a news-consuming public, I'll tell you, we are really, really lucky. The legacy of strong, independent journalism in Montana is a vibrant one that's built on the shoulders of truly great journalists who've chosen to stay in Montana when no doubt larger markets were open to them. From his first days at the Missoulian in the 1980s, it was clear to me and to most everyone that Rob Chaney was one of those foundational journalists who was serious, fair, diligent, and wicked smart. Again, Rob, thank you for doing this important work. And I want to start tonight by asking you to talk to us a little bit about how you decided to become a journalist, and then within that journey, as you started at the Missoulian, where you spent your entire career, when you knew that you were pretty darn good at it.
Well, that is very generous, Doug, and thank you. I'm not certain I've quite earned most of that, but somebody joked with me once that I'm one of those kids who made it through school by doing all of his homework on the back of the bus on the way in. And at some point, somebody who I respected said, "You know, there's an institution that pays for that skill, and that's journalism." And I actually went to school in college assuming that I wanted to do international relations, but my French never quite got to embassy level, and I, oddly enough, I can pin it to the day that my college got a word processor in the computer lab that had a delete key, and all of a sudden, the gallon jugs of whiteout that I had sitting on the desk were no longer necessary, and I didn't have to break every thought into a spelling mistake.
Oh, somehow we muted you again, so we're gonna.
There we go.
There you are.
every sentence I wrote didn't turn into a spelling mistake pothole. That hitting that delete key and being able to carry on suddenly allowed me to write. And when that and my ability to write fast got combined, this was sort of the natural place to go. I wound up going to back home to Missoula, floundering around like the usual bachelor's degree graduate trying to figure out what to do next while making pizza, and lucked into some freelance work at the Missoulian, and practically never left.
Couple some experiences at the Hungry Horse News, so you know you came into your glacier connectivity honestly as well.
I interned at the Missoulian in 1987 for a little while, and then a position at the Hungry Horse opened up, so I went up there for about 4 years and really got to know Glacier Park. Brian Kennedy was my editor. We just lost him last year. That's a real tragedy for the whole glacier world. And one of Brian's requirements was that every weekend we come back with a scenic photo, preferably from Glacier Park. And so I stomped all over that park trying to please the boss. And in the process, just sort of created a whole bunch of odds and ends and bits of string that hold the park together, and all of the stories that are attached to all of the mountains and all of the creeks and all of the trees and everything else that's in there seems to have a story attached to it. Eventually, I bounced over to the Bozeman Chronicle for a few years, and then came back to the Missoulian, and I haven't left since 1997.
Well, and I think, you know, that period of time, I guess and maybe it's just my age, but I think that, you know, the idea for me that was kind of the golden age to me of Montana journalism, right? There are a lot of people to be mentored by Sally Mock at KUFM, or Jim Gransberry, or Chuck Johnson, or Mike Dennison, or Bob Inez, right? There's a whole bunch of people, and did you find that cohort, in that cohort, was there what it looked like from the outside, that there was this really great support mechanism for reporters to really be able to refine your craft and spend time doing that kind of in-depth work?
I love and appreciate every one of those people you just mentioned, and had some really great times with them. I would add one more thing to it that unfortunately I can't really share with I can't share this experience with other journalists, but Montana is rather unique in the sense of every Montanan's access to the powers that be. Our Constitution guarantees the right to watch every government body and read every single document they produce. As a matter of course, you know, it's just right there in the Constitution that we have the right to watch and access all of that record. We are so small that, you know, our senators come looking for us. You know, you can run into Steve Daines or John Tester on a fairly regular basis. Yeah. That's getting a little bit harder in the last few years, but when I was starting in journalism, you know, hanging out with Max Bacchus for a day was well within the realm of possibility on any given year. And just having that kind of ability to see your government and your society and your culture at work without having the rope lines and the managers and the spin doctors and the big money setting all the barriers in front of you. You know, when I started traveling around the world and seeing other parts of it, seeing how other reporters worked and the mountains they had to climb just to get a yes or a no from somebody who, you know, ought to have been a public servant. I'm living in a great bubble here.
Right. We call people by their first names, right? There's Max and there's Pat, and you know, people just have to get used to that. Well, it's and I think we'll, you know, again, Rob, Rob's here to answer your questions. So feel free to to launch those in the chat. Andy Lucky, as always, is going to curate some questions for us. Andrew Smith, we have some questions for you that we're gonna ask, and Andrew's going to help us with that. And Sean O'Leary is taking a role, and we have a couple of giveaway items tonight, so Sean's going to take care of that for us. Rob, I want to get right into the book, and when I kind of follow the title, and when I went through the book, I was really quite taken by Cecily Costello's quote that she talks about in the book about I think it's something like that, bears live close to people, and we've got to figure out what works in the future, right? To me, that's kind of the idea of the grizzly in the driveway, that this increase of the interaction between bears in the wild and the fact that we're building closer to the wild. So talk to us a little bit about how you took that core and then extended it to from an article to the larger construct of the truly kind of remarkable book that really is about more than just urban rural interface, and really about a larger policy debate and even kind of philosophical debate about the role of bears. How did you kind of take that fairly simple statement and turn it into a larger narrative?
Well, it gets right at what each individual person thinks of when they think about a grizzly bear. There is the creature of imagination, the monster in the dark, the thing with the great big claws in Night of the Grizzlies that rips young girls out of their sleeping bags, and or that is the talismanic leader of the immortal animals of the supernatural world, spirituality, that is this invented creature in our heads. And then there is what you might call the legal animal. There is the creature that is managed by a wildlife agency and state legislatures and governors make rules and laws and programs that define where it can be and where it should not be, and the things that are allowable for it to do and not allowable for it to do. And they count them and they study them and they take their DNA apart and they put it into all of these boxes and categories. But that's very much a creature of paperwork. And in between those two poles is the bear, which is, a mammal with 4 legs that hibernates, that is omnivorous, that has a certain amount of territory it needs and a certain number of calories a day that it's got to have to survive. And it doesn't do paperwork, and I don't know if it has a religion. But it's definitely, real. And within that, Venn diagram of different planes of existence, stuff happens. Just in the last 2 weeks, up at Whitefish Mountain, just outside of the Whitefish Mountain ski area, some hunters who were scouting for game ran into a grizzly sow and cubs and killed the sow in an encounter. Down at Big Sky, just last week, 10 days ago, another hunter ran into a grizzly, and in that case, the grizzly one took the guy's jaw off, if I remember right. Both of these areas are the Big Sky. Just last weekend had the Rut, which is a super endurance mountain race. Right. Where a whole bunch of people in spandex and polyester, have little tiny cans of bear spray running across 10,000-foot mountaintops and through swamps that are grizzly country, because it's fun. Is that an imposition on the bear? If the bear eats a endurance runner, is that a is that equivalent to blowing your ACL? Is that a risk you take by deciding that you're going to run across Lone Mountain when grizzly bears are in hyperphagia? Big Mountain, Whitefish Mountain, it's called now, has the same kind of 24-hour runs across its tops right through one of the primest grizzly bear territories on the planet. And so, to get back to your original point of Cicely Costello observing that bears are here, this is a paperwork thing. We created these recovery areas, 6 recovery areas in the lower 48 states as part of the Grizzly Bears Endangered Species Act protection, to bring them back from somewhere around, depending on whose estimates you look at, 600 bears in 1973, maybe as few as 200. And then we put it on the list in 1975. We created these recovery areas. We've now got, north of 2,000 grizzly bears in the lower 48 states.
We lost your audio again.
These recovery areas aren't zoos. There is no, grizzly fence around the Bob Marshall Wilderness area. There's no grizzly fence around Yellowstone Park.
And bears do not read maps very well, apparently.
I kind of think they do. If there was a bear 3 years ago that raided a chicken coop outside of Phillipsburg, disappeared for a year, and came back to the day, hit the same chicken coop. They know where they are, but what they know they are, where they maybe know they are, is they used to be in the lower 48 states from Montana to Mexico.
Oh, we lost you again after the word Mexico.
I don't know what's going on here, but
it's all good.
Their evolutionary habitat was from the Pacific Ocean. That's the first recorded Westerner historical reference to a grizzly bear, as a Spanish explorer in the 1600s, seeing grizzly bears dancing on whale carcasses on the beach. I think this was more of a fight over who got the biggest bite of blubber, but regardless, they were everywhere west of the Mississippi.
Yeah.
Particularly west of the 100th meridian at the Montana-North Dakota border, from there west. And by 1975, we'd reduced that by 98%. We'd reduced them from an estimated 50,000 animals in the lower 48 to an estimated 200 to 600. Point being, where grizzly bears ought to be is not in the Bob Marshall or Glacier Park or Yellowstone Park. It's the Missouri Breaks. It's the Helena Valley. It's the Missoula Valley. Is evolutionarily where they ought to be. Legally, not so much.
Yeah, and that's a complicated question, right? Because we're a farm and ranch state, so is North and South Dakota. But as you point out in the book, and anybody who's read any Lewis and Clark, that if you read the journals, that's where they're going to find their interactions with the bears, is in the plains, in the grassy plains, and yet that hasn't been identified as habitat, in large part because it is in direct conflict, right, with our agricultural community. You also talk a little bit, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit here. You talk about how American Prairie Reserve is trying to break the mold there a little bit, and that's been controversial, right? But that is a plains type environment where they're working on bringing back kind of more traditional species, bison, et cetera, and that's a conflict. So I think I hear what I hear you saying is it's not so much the raw number of 1,000 or 2,000 bears, but the fact that they're confined into a type of habitat that doesn't allow them the kind of range they might need in order to thrive in a way that would cause less human bear disturbance interaction. Is that fair?
Right up until where you said less human conflict.
Okay.
Um, they, if you read the Lewis and Clark journals, they run into grizzlies from the 100th meridian, pretty much right after they leave North Dakota. It's grizzlies every day and all the way down until they hit the Rockies. And as soon as they do, as soon as they punch their way across Lost Trail Pass and down through the Big Hole and whatnot, the bears vanish. They disappear from the records. And they do not return in the records until on the way back, about the time they get to Three Forks. All of a sudden, they run into bears again. Grizzly bears are a plains animal, and they are a river basin critter. They, capitalized on the gigantic piles of protein that big rivers like the Missouri and the Yellowstone regularly produced when animals got caught in a mud bog or broke through the ice or otherwise, died on the beach. And that's what they're doing today. They are coming out of the Rocky Mountain front, and the first thing they do is they find a river basin and they follow it wherever it leads. And we have been tracking them all the way out through the Missouri breaks. And I think it's really only a matter of time before one of them gets all the way out there and discovers, hey, there's a whole lot of elk and buffalo and cows and other good stuff out here. And something in the back of my DNA memory calls this home.
Yeah, super interesting. So Amy Lucky, I know we have a question from Margaret, and then I think Andrew Smith, I'm going to call on you to launch our first poll question of the night. Amy?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's great to have you. I usually love it when Margaret unmutes, and because I just love her voice and when she asks a question. So I'm going to put her on the spot and let her ask her question.
Okay, but let me just preface it by saying I've never read a book where I knew of or knew personally so many people you mentioned. It's just amazing. I think lots of us are probably in that boat. It's just incredible, right? And putting them all together. But anyway, so here's my question, and it's just nitpicking, but I think you might know the answer. I was absolutely fascinated by the story of the sows in Sweden who have figured out that the way not to end up dead is to keep their teenagers close for an extra year. So, I mean, millions of years of bear evolution and what the neighbors are doing, how on earth did they figure this out? By getting shot at by hunters who missed? Or I'm fascinated if anyone gave you the why of that.
That's a question worth spending an awful lot of research dollars on, I think. I talked with, among others, Cicely Costello about that. She got to go out there and try to chase some of those bears around. She referred to them as ghost bears. But going beyond Sweden, there are more, there are what, 5,000 grizzly bears in Romania. I think there are 3,000 in Sweden. Europe is crawling with grizzly bears. They call them brown bears over there. And they get into trouble and they eat sheep and they raid garbage cans and they do all the kinds of stuff that bears over here do. But for the, I don't think they've had a mauling in Europe that I can recall in the last decade. The grizzly bear attacking a person. And why that is so, there are theories running around that Europe is just so much more of a compact place, and they have very different relationships with the landscape and property lines and dealing with wildlife. The Eastern Bloc countries like Romania were very kind of calling back to the king's deer. Grizzlies were not bred, but fed, maintained. There were all this network of hunting lodges that had feeders put out for to grow big bears, because if you could get Nicolae Ceausescu to come and visit your hunting lodge and kill one of your big bears, that you had some political patronage points that you could cash in elsewhere, and nobody else could touch the bears. Now, to boil that down to some kind of a formula and say this is the trick for managing human-bear conflict, I'm not sure it's going to be that easy. But the facts on the ground are that there are places, like lots of parts of Europe, like Japan, like Mongolia. Doug Chadwick's book on the Gobi Grizzlies, I'm sure a lot of you probably went through that. Wildly different human-bear interactions and human-bear relations than what we're dealing with here in the Rocky Mountain West.
Great question. Thanks, Margaret. Andrew, let's poll our audience, shall we?
Sounds great. I'll launch our first poll question. So we're asking about what your grizzly in the driveway experience has been. Have you been running into bears in your, maybe not literally in your driveway, it could be literally in your driveway, but maybe around town, seeing your garbage cans knocked over, anything like that? What's that been like for you? We'll give everyone a second to answer, but they're coming in quick. Already got just over 30 respondents. Most people saying no. I'd be curious about the geographic distribution of these. But we've got 7, so that's about 20, now 8, about 25%, a quarter of our group has had this happen once a year or less, and then about 10% of them are frequently having grizzly in the driveway experiences.
So anybody in the occasional or frequent category want to unmute and tell us your grizzly, tell Rob your grizzly story?
Margaret has shared hers in the chat. Diagonally across the road from me, south of Big Fork, 7 or so grizzlies all were on an elk carcass up behind a cherry orchard. Jay saw the game camera footage.
If anybody wants to see it, just look on Facebook at the East Shore Flathead Lake site, and you can see it. And as I understand it, a hunter had left an elk cadaver up there, and they were on it. But there were 3 or 4 youngsters. I sent the image to Tim Manley, and he said that's what we were looking at. So it's quite something. And that is maybe a quarter of a mile from my front door. So I do always check my driveway left and right before I go out. And I'm down south of Big Fork by about 10 miles.
And Amy Lucky, also a Big Fork resident. I know that I've seen basically photographs of grizzlies in your driveway.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I'm north of Big Fork, away from Margaret, but still in Big Fork, and I have a little pond out back, and we watched grizzlies swim in the pond this spring. It was the first time we'd seen grizzlies. We see black bears, but never grizzlies, so pretty exciting. Big Fork, I guess, is the place to be if y'all want to see grizzlies.
If I can just briefly add one more. Okay, this is a couple summers ago, but there are 3 grizzly teenagers, family group, and they are all sadly now passed on, but they worked the East Shore for the whole season without getting into trouble. They were later relocated. But what they would do was I have footage of this. They would hang out on my side lawn of an evening, get ready, play, wrestle around, and then trot off to go work the orchards. And then around 3 or 4 in the morning, they'd come trotting back, nose to tail, and back into the woods. So, in terms of strategies for survival, they had one worked out.
Well, it's getting more and more prevalent out there, that's for sure. So I want to I know we're getting some more questions in the chat, but I can't resist kind of launching a little bit into this idea of and I'll use Jordan Fisher Smith's title of his book, Engineering Eden, right? And I think that Leopold talks a little bit differently, the junior, about whenever we put our hands in the dirt, we're impacting nature. And so when we do it, we ought to really be thoughtful about what we're doing. And so this idea of engineering Eden, and how does that, I mean, I'm sure you grapple with this. I mean, it's such a tough, do try or do nothing, a famous Max Baucus quotation. Not that there were very many, but that is one of them. How do you grapple with that? In the book, you suggest early on in the book that as one thinks about this, and that one might compare it to the engineering of the computer Eden of Bill Gates and those guys have changed the ecosystem completely about what we saw. Tell me about kind of that. Had to be a hard thing to grapple with this in the book and write about and come to some certainty. And I think it might help us then transition to a little brief snippet about your upcoming book.
So one of the things that got this book started was a interagency grizzly bear committee meeting. It was in 2018, where they took a break, and the presenters all got out. This was up at Quataqnuck in Polson. It was the first time that they'd ever had an IGBC meeting on an Indian reservation, which was kind of amazing. But this group of biologists all got out on the deck outside the hotel for a group picture. And it was, Chris Servine and Tim Manley and, about 8 or 9 other guys. And earlier in the meeting, somebody had been mentioning, oh yeah, we were all in the van together with Jamie Jonkel's dad, Chuck, on the Border Grizzly project. And it just crystallized for me all of a sudden that in the span of one human career, grizzlies had gone from just about winking out, just about disappearing as an extinct species, to being very, very close to legally recovered. And that one year, or that one career, also overlapped one of the biggest, most consequential accelerations of human culture. I mean, it was the computer age. These guys all got started when we were still literally writing code for everything that any computer could do. And pretty much all they could do was higher math. And when they were taking this picture, they were taking it with cell phones that had more computing power between somebody's thumbs than all of NASA had to put Neil Armstrong on the moon. And we were using it to take pictures of a bunch of old guys. That level of rearranging normal, going from what your grandfather and grandmother did, what their grandfather and their grandmother did, and going on way back,
Right,
had not changed for the better part of a century. The biggest difference was maybe electric lights and the rotary telephone. And then in the space of 30 years, we went from dial-up phones to iPhones. We went from no bears to lots of bears. And when you're trying to decide what's normal, what's okay, what do we want, how do we measure it? When your measuring sticks are stretching like taffy back and forth, it's really hard to feel confident that what you think is normal is going to stay that way for another decade, or maybe another 5 years, or maybe another 6 months. And I wanted to reflect that larger global social concern, because the whole planet is going through this. We're trying to decide how many grizzlies is enough, and the whole planet is just trying to decide how many people is enough.
and maybe that's maybe, you know, Moore's law and other things have changed our expectation about how long it should take to do things. Right? Moore's law says computing capacity doubles every whatever it is. And so we want this immediate gratification, but we forget that maybe it's taken hundreds of generations to get where we are, and we're trying to fix it within a career.
And it's going the other direction at the exact same time.
Right.
The problems and our decision space to deal with them are collapsing at this, you know, at the inverse rate that the complexity of the problems are expanding.
Yeah.
This is not something where you get to, you know, ponder across your entire career staring at the blackboard going, is it E equals MC squared or MC cubed?
Right.
You know, you got to make some decisions like next week,
Right.
or ships sail and crash into icebergs and game over.
Yeah.
And that's a really discomforting, challenging position to acknowledge. And, you know, I really understand why people get into what they call eco-anxiety. And it's like,
Yeah, right, exactly. No question. So Amy, I know we've got a bunch of more questions that have populated into the chat. So I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. I actually think this is a perfect time to let, there's another Doug on the call, Doug Bonham, and he messaged me directly with some things to share. And Doug, I'm wondering if you'll unmute and ask your question and share your experience.
Thanks, Amy. I have to echo Margaret in that one reason your book was so much fun is I know at least 90% of the people you mentioned in that book. I'm a former student of Chuck Jonkel. I was a research partner with Derek Craighead. And my early career was a victim of the animosity between the Park Service and the Craigheads. It happened when I drove tour buses in Glacier and Denali. And my tours included describing the misguided bear and elk management in Yellowstone. And I would raise the topic by asking for a show of hands on my bus. How many of you been to Yellowstone? Almost all the hands would go up. How many of you were there before 1969? Hands go up. How many bears did you see? We saw 10. We saw 15. They were on the car. They were on the picnic tables. Then I would ask, how many of you were there after 1973? And so we're covering the decade 73 to 83. All summer long, I had a total of 3 people who had seen a bear in Yellowstone between 73 and 83. Yeah. And that generated the questions, but the Park Service did not appreciate my answers to those questions. They dressed up a ranger like a tourist, put him on my bus, and I was fired. The letter I got was, my views are not consistent with the park philosophy. Now, the good news is there's been a dramatic change. Congress spanked the Park Service pretty hard. They restructured the Park Service so that science would have a seat at the table. And since then, bear management is dramatically better than it was. My question is, do you see additional new opportunities to create an even stronger role for science in the parks?
I love that question. My hesitation comes in that, you know, what you ran into was one version of science with a more privileged position trumping another version. You know, it wasn't just the National Park Service philosophy that I think you were accused of violating. They had the National Park Service biologists had you know, done a whole lot of work trying to figure out what was going on and how it got that way, and then they put that all into, you know, peer-reviewed published journals. And once you do that, in any part of science, I'm not picking on just the Park Service, you tend to kind of cement your feet to the ground. And, you know, the old joke that scientists tell all the time of, you know, first they fight you, then they ignore you, then they knew that it was right all along. And these sort of epochal revolutions that science periodically goes through undo a whole bunch of stuff that people base their careers on, and then all of a sudden turned out to be wrong, or have to adapt to a whole bunch of information that they didn't realize was going on. You know, one of the biggest challenges for, I think, American public lands management is it comes, you know, rooted so deeply in the 1964 Wilderness Act, which, you know, in its beautiful and eloquent language, assumes that the places that it's protecting are beautiful because they are untrammeled by man. You know, where man is a visitor and does not remain, which very conveniently erases a whole bunch of men and women who did remain and who did trammel and who were very active participants in the function of the ecosystem. I'm, you know, obviously referring to the indigenous communities that were all over these landscapes and actively manipulating them and affecting them by their presence. And, you know, to create this pristine presumption of a starting point for managing landscapes, you know, is got an error built into its foundational equation. And then once you run that program for a couple of decades, you have some really big metastasized problems that you've got to figure out how to go back and undo. You know, look at forest management all over the Rocky Mountain West, where we spent a century putting out fires before 10 a.m. in the morning, because that seemed to be the thing to do. And we're realizing to our dismay and our extreme discomfort. I'm looking out my window right now and barely able to see 4 miles down the way because of all the controlled burning we're doing in the Missoula Valley right today, trying to get rid of that backlog of fuel that would have been burned on a regular basis, 150 years before. So, you know, a role for science is obviously needed. A role for objective science is obviously needed. And before everybody jumps on me and says, well, you know, what's objectivity? I have a pretty solid definition of what I think objectivity is. And it's what, you know, we are never probably going to know what is exactly right. We will never probably know what is exactly true, but we can figure out what's not correct. We can figure out equations that don't add up. We can figure out plans that don't work. And we can prune those from the conversation. The earth is not flat. Putting out fires on a persistent 10 a.m. basis is not a healthy way to allow an ecosystem to function or be managed. And clinging to things that we have proven to ourselves to be ineffective or counterproductive is not helpful. So I think we need to work really hard when we say, yes, let's have science at the table, to make sure that whoever is pushing that science respects that rule and isn't pushing the science that we can just keep on drilling oil for the next century because it's more convenient that way.
No, it's a great question, Doug. Thanks so much for asking it. Andrew, speaking of questions, let's launch question number 2 for our group. We've got about 15 minutes left. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and then maybe Sean, if you've got our contest winners, we could do that after that.
Great. Just launched our question about people's thoughts on grizzly delisting in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, which includes Glacier National Park. You've got a few options, though maybe not quite as much of a gradient as you might like, but it's yes, no, I don't know, and it's complicated. We'll give people another minute, but so far results are 2/3 opposed, a third unsure, and just one in favor, one it's complicated so far. Okay, looks like we got just about everyone who answered the last question. Share those numbers with you all. So yeah, got just one in favor and one when it's complicated. Would the I'd like to say more it's complicated person like to say more?
Please.
Don't be shy.
Not quite ready to say more yet.
Okay. So Amy, I know maybe this is a good segue. I think there was a question about delisting and then the court cases and whether Rob has seen any kind of policy that local governments might. Have you seen that same question?
I have. Let me scroll up. I was down. Yeah, let's see. Here's a policymaking question. Montana is currently uniquely well represented with Martha Williams at the helm of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Tracy Stone Manning directing the Bureau of Land Management. Have you seen an impact, Rob, to the policy making by having these Montana leaders in those positions?
I wouldn't attribute anything directly to like a Montana bias or a home field advantage or something along those lines from Martha or Tracy. I know both of them reasonably well and respect both of them quite a bit. But they are parts of a very large operation with an awful lot of moving parts at the federal level. And at the moment, they are pretty significantly matched with a bunch of local politicians who are diametrically opposed to the position that the Fish and Wildlife Service and the BLM have taken regarding grizzly bears. And how that is going to play out is, especially with an election year coming up, going to be a real hot potato, I think. It's going to put, a gigantic amount of pressure on John Tester, who was in a very similar position right after he got elected the first time, for 2007, with the wolf question. The wolf question was not going to resolve in Endangered Species Act rulemaking process. It was resolved by Tester putting a rider into a must-pass piece of legislation saying wolves shall be delisted and the courts shall not be allowed to review this decision. I am not making any predictions about Tester's position regarding grizzly bears, but the potential for anybody in Congress to insert something like that, and if I remember correctly, Representative Matt Rosendale already has done such a thing in the House, where he's put in amendments to various bills or proposed making bills that would remove the grizzly bear from endangered species protection and from legal review. So if somebody with the appropriate amount of juice in Congress wanted to try to pull that during election year, that would move a lot of needles in the Rocky Mountain West, pro and con, as far as people who were deeply engaged in wildlife and public lands management. Right at the moment, the rulemaking process from Fish and Wildlife Service is that they are reviewing the grizzlies' threatened status in light of petitions from the states, from Montana and Wyoming. Idaho also petitioned, but their petition was thrown out as being facetious, I think it said. But you know, the state's petition, so the agency has to respond. What I'm hearing from people in the agency is that the states have gone so anti-predator in their legislatures and wildlife management agencies that there's no way the federal agency could let it go, because there's no way the states can guarantee that the grizzly will survive under local management. So, you know, you're just setting up a headbanger right there, and that sets up an opportunity for somebody to come in and you know, try to diffuse the fight legislatively. Those are not a bunch of reactive agents that you want in the same test tube.
Yeah, the stakes are high, and the battlefield is pitched. That's for sure. So Sean O'Leary, we've got two winners. I've got a Glacier Conservancy cap, and that's going to go to
Our first winner is Landon Petrie.
Landon. Congratulations. Then it would only be fitting on a Grizzly night to have a Grizzly plush, and that is going to go to.
That winner is going to be Victoria Williams.
Wonderful. Landon, Victoria, congratulations. Thanks for that. Now, it would not be a book club, and I did warn our erstwhile guest today that there would be a speed round. It would not be a book club without a speed round. So, Rob, we have 5 questions for you. They have 2 options for the answer. The first 2 are traditional questions that we ask our erudite guests. So the first one is Abbey or Stegner?
I have to confess, I haven't read a whole lot of Stegner.
I don't blame you.
I enjoy Abbey, but he falls right into that 64 wilderness trap. He's got some incredible blind spots. So I'm going to land in the middle and say Chadwick.
Okay, well, that comes later. That comes later. There is a Doug category, which comes later. The second traditional question is, when it comes to Glacier Park, east side or west side?
West side.
West side. Okay, well, you know, I know that you have a boat tour, you know, history to hold up. So I respect that greatly. Okay, so this is Missoula dining / drinking establishments, Mo Club or the Top Hat?
Oh, I'm actually a flippers guy myself, but were I forced to choose, it'd probably be the Top Hat. Better
Top Hat. Okay, very good. Now, in this is the non-Lee newspaper category, and we're going to talk about the heyday now, not just the electronic version, but the heyday, the Great Falls Tribune or the Bozeman Chronicle.
Well, I worked for the Bozeman Chronicle.
True. Scott McMillian. I mean, it's, you know, it's got a pedigree.
Parker Heinlein.
But Chuck Johnson, Peter Johnson.
I would have to say that it was pretty well acknowledged when I was just getting into the business that the Tribune was the state paper.
State paper, paper record. I respect that, and I think that, you know, even your friends at the Chronicle would do that. Now, this is the Doug category, and so we pretty much know, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Doug Chadwick or Doug Peacock?
Chadwick, hands down.
Chadwick. Okay, yeah, Chad. But Chad has been a guest of ours twice with both of his books. 4/5 of Grizzly, you know, really feeds in with your book. Really, it's a great bookends to a reading year for sure. So that's
and you're looking at thrown off a plane reading Wolverine Way.
Oh my gosh, yeah. He talked to us. That was one of our first year book club events. Was Wolverine Way. What a terrific writer and person, human being. Both Dougs are, but Doug Chadwick, particularly a friend of ours here at the Conservancy. So I want to make sure in our final few minutes, and thanks everybody for another great time together, that we that we do get a little bit of a preview. You talked to us as we prepared for this about a book currently in the making. Tell us a little about what you're thinking and what that might be and how that's going.
So the next one is looking at some big choices that we have made or are about to make, particularly in Glacier Park, but that also have worldwide ramifications. It's the working title is Playing God in Glacier Park, but I've realized that is really unfair to a bunch of my National Park Service friends who got badly beaten up by Playing God in Yellowstone. And I'm not, this isn't a look at the National Park Service. This is looking at us as humans. And our choices to do things like, try to save bull trout by putting them in lakes that have never had fish before. By bringing back buffalo almost as an invasive species on a landscape that hasn't had them for 200 years. By considering, when Al Gore comes out and points at Grinnell Glacier and says that's going to be gone by 2030, are we going to do anything like manipulate the climate or cover it with glass beads and prevent it from melting? And looking at ourselves, what are we willing to do, or more importantly, to not do regarding playing in a place like Glacier Park? I've spent a couple of years biking over Logan Pass, training to do it in the acoustic way on a pedal bike, and finally getting good enough and getting a time when I'm not avalanched or otherwise blocked. And then as soon as I did that, I went and rented an e-bike and tried that experience. And the question of enhancing ourselves and removing barriers to our own performance in order to do things that otherwise we couldn't do just because we can. Is there a line to that? Is there a limit? Is there a question that we maybe haven't wrestled with, especially when there are other things, externalities to those behaviors that could come and bite us in the ass?
It's the story of our time, right? It's AI in a different, it's a discussion about AI in a different environment. So, well, I think I'll raise my hand for a copy of that book. I'm pretty sure that there are 50 or 60 other people online tonight who will do likewise. If you'd like, Rob's been kind enough to agree to sign book plates for us. So if you'd like a book plate signed, please either email me or Amy at glacier.org, Doug at glacier.org, or just put it in the chat and we will take care of that. Rob Chaney, I want to thank you for your time and for your caring for this park from your days as a boat skipper on was it the DeSmet? Is that what you, was that your boat?
It was the DeSmet.
DeSmet, yeah, fantastic. To really, again, I can't thank you enough. I think Montana is so fortunate to have serious journalists who certainly could be working in bigger population areas and who have chosen to stay here because of your caring for place and people. That means a lot. And thank you for sharing your evening with us. I know they're precious, and this great book, and we'll look forward to seeing you up here in Glacier Country anytime soon. Thanks, Rob.
That is very kind, and to all of you who tuned in for this, I greatly appreciate your caring and concern for a place that we all love.
Well, until next time, we have one more this year. We're going to talk about the Conservation Corps in Glacier National Park, which will be very, very interesting in December. And then we'll be back at it in 2024. Look for an exciting announcement about the books for next year here soon. Again, Rob Chaney, thank you very much. To everybody in the Glacier family, thanks for a wonderful evening, and be safe out there. Thanks so much. Good night.